Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining my discussion on my paper. I think sustainably, therefore I are for the DEFSA 2021 conference proceedings. I am going to share my screen. As mentioned, my paper is titled, I think sustainably, therefore I are, and it explores design thinking through a first principle approach in fashion design praxis. So the paper aims to look at emerging design approach, which is the first principle approach, and I refer to it as emerging, as designing from first principles is not a new concept. It has been done within other disciplines, but it has not extensively been explored within fashion design. So this emanates from a current MA design study that's nearing completion. This paper reflects on the inclusivity that this first principle design approach offers to align 4IR with sustainable thinking. It's situated within fashion design praxis, and it addresses the limitations that the current linear design and production process has. So the focus of this first principle approach is to design from a set of principles that have been synthesized from investigating various design thinking approaches or frameworks and aligning these to the UN sustainability goals. So looking at the relationship between digital tech and sustainable strategies, 4IR can offer a means to further these goals alongside a creative and positive impact towards sustainability. So looking at sustainable opportunities within the design process, the integration of sustainable strategies within the traditional fashion design process has not often been examined according to Gould and Risnan. And conventionally, designers have viewed the concept of sustainability as an afterthought to their fashion design praxis, meaning that oftentimes within fashion design, we might include sustainable aspects like sustainable textiles, or within this linear process of designing, somewhere we will implement sustainable ideas or sustainable elements. But it has not extensively been investigated how to, from the get-go, implement sustainable thinking throughout this process. So this poses a challenge as well as an opportunity for the design and production team to bring on board strategies that influence design and production process directly. So Gould refers to Lawson that suggests that the traditional design process needs to be investigated and challenged, as designers need to be more inclined to adapt to a changing future industry. So 4IR can offer a means to align the goals of sustainable development with continued digital transformation. However, there needs to be a focus on how research and practice can implement this alignment, and sustainability aspects can gain more influence within 4IR. So looking at the fashion design and production process, according to Sinha and supported by Gould, it is a systematized and sequential series of activities and phases that's evident within various sectors of the fashion industry. So these activities and phases have been well documented through various educational texts, which hints towards or indicates a generic design process that we do follow within fashion design. So this process does consist of 5 distinct phases. Firstly, the research and analysis phase, the synthesis phase, then the selection phase, manufacturing phase, and lastly, the distribution phase. So within each of these phases, there are specific activities and tasks, and the responsibility of each fall to a specific member of staff, department, or facility that's involved within this process. The division of these duties, as outlined by Gould, are dependent on the production and hence also the company scale. So the larger the company, the less reach the designer actually has, and the influence of the fashion designer across these phases can also change according to their duties within this larger setting. So within a larger setting, it becomes more well-defined, it becomes restricted, mostly to that first phase within this linear process. So the design of sustainable fashion necessitates that we garner more knowledge about and show more support for sustainable systems of production, according to Fletcher. There's no quick fix to this complex issue. And therefore, there's also no easy solution to attain that perfect garment, which is able to function within the sphere of sustainability. So rather, addressing these problems require a combination of creativity, of mindfulness, and information about the processes, approaching problems from a life cycle point of view, according to Fletcher. So an opportunity thus lies in reevaluating the design process and investigating alternative methods of design and production and challenging the conventions of these processes. So the wasteful nature of the fashion system is a direct result of the conventional design process. Hierarchical processes within the system entails design, pattern cutting, construction, and production, which has substantial wasteful side effects. So in order to change the wasteful nature of these conventional fashion design and production processes, designers need to adapt and they need to cultivate new thinking processes that is going to affect the phases that they function in most actively. So designing from first principles. Designing from first principles can be seen as a means of generating good or successful designs, and it's oftentimes commended for achieving creative designs, according to Cross. The difficulty that this approach to design does pose is identifying what those first principles might be in any given design situation, whether artificial or natural. And according to Dawes, consideration needs to be given to what the end solution of the design needs to achieve. So the freedom then lies in how one gets to the solution. Within the MA study that this paper is based on, it is not so much, it was quite difficult actually to design or change this mindset that we have in fashion praxis of designing from a sketch or a blueprint and taking it through from pattern making to construction. But designing from first principles, it is not so much about what that garment's end look is going to be, what working details it will have, whether it's a shirt or a dress or a pair of pants, but it's more importantly, it's been designed with these ideas of sustainability in mind and not so much what the aesthetic final outcome would be. So this concept from Dawes, that the freedom lies in how one gets to the solution and not so much about the end solution, is supported by Cross, that suggests that one should consider the conceptual boundary that is used to define the function of the product as a way to create impactful designs. So any meaningful understanding of design is centered around the concept of designing from first principles. It stands to argue that designing takes place by identifying requirements or desired functions, and the form of the structures taking shape are based on these established requirements. The function of a product that needs to be designed should not be seen as a static concept, but it's something that can be developed and can be evolved during the course of the design process. Therefore, the process of getting there is more important or holds more value than that final aesthetic outcome. And there should be adaptability within that, especially if you are designing from first principles. And as a designer within fashion design praxis, you have a set of first principles and you can almost customize it and see what works for your approach to design, but still the focus should be on the process and not the final outcome. Cross also looks at a similar approach to design through the function analysis method, where the purpose of the method is to concentrate on what needs to be achieved by a new design and not how it needs to be achieved. So first principles and sustainability. Sustainability can be viewed as the concept that underpins the process of sustaining current resources, which are limited, in order to ensure future generations are able to maintain favorable living conditions and meet their needs for said resources. So this definition is supported by various scholars, and it's also the definition for sustainable development, which is used interchangeably with sustainability. It presupposes the importance of the development rather than focusing on implementing strategies that's going to maintain this current conditions that we find ourselves in. So sustainable development can be further assessed through the intersection of three interrelated concepts: economic, social, and environmental systems. So Barber and Burgess state that the objective of sustainable development is a continuous trade-off between those three pillars through the means of an adaptive process. This is also supported by other authors, and the three areas of action need to be tackled simultaneously. So neglecting one of the pillars will lead to the unfulfillment of the sustainability goal. So for example, focusing on only economic growth while neglecting environmental concerns can create additional costs to counteract the environmental impacts. And this can result in economic benefits becoming null and void. So there's no clear guidance as to how this adaptive process would need to be navigated or how the trade-off between those three pillars need to happen. However, they need to be balanced. Focused on improving one system while neglecting the other is not going to result in a sustainable outcome. And this adaptive system, however, shows sustainable development to be at the intersection of those three interlinked systems and their goals. And this brings me to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 goals that are interlinked with the purpose to achieve sustainable development. So during the development of these goals, the three pillars were explicitly embedded within the formulation of said goals. And the UN agenda highlights the interlinked and integrated nature of the SDGs, which are vital to the success of sustainable development. So they form a blueprint for a more sustainable future and look at major global issues we face. So hence the first principle approach also finds its foundation within these principles in order to navigate this trade-off and adaptive system. So the role of the fashion designer has clear parameters in which to function within each phase. And by investigating and analyzing the designer's tasks and responsibilities within these parameters, one can identify areas for positive sustainable interventions. So designers should cultivate a good understanding of the various sustainable strategies in order to align these two areas within the design and production process, identifying a specific point of intervention and applying the most favorable strategy. Therefore, the designer needs to consider a criteria that meets the needs of the environment and society, as well as those that are economically driven. The concept of first principles functions within the theoretical framework, assuming the position that the designer's solutions developed through an identified requirement or set of desired functions and advances from this set of functions to an appropriate final solution. By crafting a set of sustainable first principles, the designer can, at the very start of this process, determine where sustainable strategies can be incorporated and therefore maintain a more overarching role within the process. So as mentioned earlier, where depending on the scale of the company, the designer's role changes. Designing from first principles allows for the designer's role to be far more far-reaching to ensure that the crafting of the final outcome is informed by these requirements or these principles. So by using the 17 SDGs that are underpinned by the pillars of sustainability, this first principle design approach is situated within a framework that's informed by core sustainability goals that become the identifying requirements or desired functions of the design. As Haupt suggests, the designer needs to consider the intended purpose of the garment and establish the sustainable strategies at the start of the design process. This approach allows the designer to consider the key sustainability requirements or characteristics that the design needs to align to, which directs the final structure or outcome of the design. So design-led research within a qualitative paradigm is defined by process rather than output. And during the process of applying these first principles, the most important finding was this challenge that this new way of designing posed to traditional thinking as well as the conventional design process. And during the prototyping phase of the study, the practitioner researcher investigated the outcome of this first principle design approach through the application of zero-waste pattern making. So the challenge very much lay in discarding traditional linear design processes and adapting to a new way of thinking and designing. And aesthetic components of the garment, such as defined apparel category, as well as proportion, shape, and garment, which is traditionally defined by the blueprint of the technical drawing became a secondary element that was influenced by what the intended purpose or function of the garment was. So how that aligned to the first principles that were included in or as a starting point to this design process. So within practice stage research, the designer forms an integral part of the research, actively participating in the epistemological process and not merely becoming an observer. So the new knowledge is created through the researcher's interaction with the research process, which becomes explorative and self-reflective. And it's not necessarily to always include this artifact, which is this final design, but the artifact was a means of facilitating this whole processes, and the prototype that was created aided in the reflection process of the study. So therefore, the new knowledge creation lies solely in the process, with the prototype adding, or the final design outcome adding within this reflective process that was included. So the first principle design approach places emphasis on the garment's alignment to the developed first principle framework, more than the aesthetic outcome thereof. And the practitioner researcher's role during the process was to identify the specific principles that they would align to their design, and hence starting the design process from this instead of this traditional technical drawing blueprint. So this is contradictory to the traditional way of designing, where the final outcome of the design is used as the starting point. So sustainable design within fashion practice should be informed by a life cycle point of view that's going to create impactful designs that consider the conceptual boundary of the product to define its function. And within this case, that was sustainability, rather than solely focusing on the aesthetics value of this design. So looking at 4IR, this means of designing opens up a way for 4IR to be included. So the concept of circular economy is an alternative to our current linear and conventional concept of take, make, and dispose. And ideals such as designing out waste and emissions, keeping goods and materials in operation, and regenerating natural systems are all concepts that are underpinned by a circular economy, and also 4IR, and bringing together 4IR, digital tech, and the circular economy concept can allow for global growth through sustainable practices and ensure that this development is aligned to that of the Sustainable Development Goals, which directly inform this means of designing from first principles. So thank you for your time and listening to my discussion of my paper. I do think there is still a lot that can be included and discussed in terms of this new way of designing. But again, thank you for listening and goodbye.